I say, let's go for it. Good evening, everybody.
Rose Duncan, my wonderful friend and colleague, and I are so thrilled to have this opportunity to spend some time with you this evening, wrapping up what I've heard to be a wonderful series on the Acts of the Apostles. And so we've been asked to bring it home. And as we do that, I'm going to ask Rose if she'll open us in prayer.
Of course. So the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
And now, friends, we pick up from where Randy left off. And last week, Randy walked us through through Paul's missionary journeys. And we also found throughout that section that he covered that opposition is really a constant theme throughout Acts. The opposition against the gospel come to a high point really as chapter 20 is ending with Paul speaking to the Ephesian elders. And Paul relays that because he is captive to the Spirit, his next journey is to Jerusalem. But it is also that the Holy Spirit that has told him he will suffer because of the gospel. And I want to read a little bit of that section for you. And now, as a captive to the Spirit, I am on my way to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit will happen to me there, except that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and persecutions are waiting for me. So at the end of chapter 20, there's a really tearful scene in the sense of that as Paul leaves the Ephesians and is bound for Jerusalem, where he is sure to be horribly persecuted. And it's really telling that at the end of that chapter, it reads, there was much weeping among them all. They embraced Paul and kissed him, grieving especially because of what he had said, and that is that he would probably not see them again. And then they went for the ship. And thank you, Janae, for putting up the map for me. So Paul and the other travel companions sail from Ephesus. And I put one of the map up so that you could actually follow as I start to say where he's moving around through the Mediterranean Sea and the ports. So his companions, all of them sail from Miletus to Kos, from Kos, then they sail to Rhodes, and then on to the port of Patara. At Patara, they caught a ship heading to Tyre, Phoenicia. So they're covering some ground here, if you haven't noticed. And the ship passed to the south of the island of Cyprus. And upon arriving in Tyre, because the ship had to unload cargo, they found the disciples and remained with them 7 days in the site. Now, the Spirit had indicated to the disciples what awaited Paul in Jerusalem. So they told Paul not to go. There are several people telling him not to go. But Paul just continued. The disciples accompanying him outside of the city. And they knelt and they prayed on the shore. Paul and his companions then boarded the ship and departed. So they sailed from Tyre to, I've just got stuck on my own word, Ptolemais. And they greeted the believers there and remained just 1 day. And then they went to Caesarea. So Paul and his companions went to Philip, the evangelist's house. And he was one of the 7. And Philip had 4 unmarried daughters who had the gift of prophecy. Now, this is one of those times when we wonder why Luke felt that it was an important detail to record that these unmarried daughters had the gift of prophecy, because he kind of drops us there. But the one thing that becomes important after that is that the prophet Agabus came down from Judea. Now, we encountered Agabus in chapter 11, if you can remember back then, when he predicted by the Spirit there would be a severe famine, leading to the disciples deciding to send relief to Judea. So Agabus took Paul's belt and bound his own hands and feet. And this was to indicate that Paul would be bound and delivered to the Gentiles in Jerusalem, as the Holy Spirit had revealed. And I just want to share that little space with you as well. So thus the Spirit says, this is the way the Jews in Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles. When we heard this, we and the people there urged him not to go to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, what are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I am ready not only to be bound, but even to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus. So both his traveling companions and those in Caesarea really pleaded with Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered in verse 13, again, why are you weeping and why are you breaking my heart? Because he knew what he was called to do by the Spirit on behalf of Christ our Savior. So Paul and his companions proceed on to Jerusalem. And they were accompanied by some of the disciples from Caesarea. And they were to lodge in Mnason of Cyprus, who was an early disciple. They met him with the other Jerusalem disciples, and they met them gladly or joyfully. The next day, Paul and his companions met with James and the elders to give a description of the things which God had done among the Gentiles in his ministry. The disciples glorified the Lord upon hearing these things, and James and the elders then explained to Paul the problem that he would face. A multitude of the Jews had believed, as they were zealous for the law. They had been informed that Paul taught Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. That is, not to circumcise their children, nor to keep the customs. This continues to haunt him even after the meeting in the Council of Jerusalem back in chapter 15. He is still considered a threat to the temple, the Mosaic law, and to the very people of Israel. He cannot shake, in a sense, what has been attached to him about denying the law. They expected these Jewish believers to learn that Paul was actually in the city. And so James and the elders gave Paul a plan. So he said that he should accompany 4 men who had taken a vow to purify himself as an act of charity, pay their expenses in an effort to show that Paul kept the law and the customs as a devout Jew. And they reiterated that the believing Gentiles were not subject to the law. This, as I said, keeps coming up as a thorn, in a sense, for Paul to deal with. So Paul followed the plan from James and the elders. He took the men and was purified with them. Then they entered the temple. But trouble always follows Paul. So the Jews from Asia saw Paul in the temple, and they stirred up a crowd, and they seized him, and they cried out charges just as James and the elders had expected. Additionally, they charged that Paul had brought Greeks or Gentiles into the temple and had defiled the place. So they had seen one of the Ephesians with Paul in the city and supposed that he had been brought into the temple. So the Jews seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and as they sought to kill him, word came to the Roman commander or the tribune about the uproar. So when the Jews saw the tribune and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. And the commander took Paul and bound him with chains. He asked what he had done, but he could not get an answer from the mob. He then took Paul into the barracks, and when they reached the stairs of the barracks, Paul tried to be carried to the violence of the mob. So basically, he was imprisoned as protective custody to save him from the mob that was after him. So Paul asked to speak with the tribune, and then he asked Paul if he could speak Greek. And so he asked him if he was an Egyptian leader of assassins. So all these accusations are coming toward Paul. And Paul replied that he was a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of an important city. Paul then requested to speak to the people. And the commander gave Paul permission to speak. But then Paul began to speak to them in Hebrew. So we end this chapter 21 as Paul has made this journey from Ephesus to Jerusalem. He's been warned constantly, every place he goes, by those who are close to him, those who are followers, those who are also part of the evangelism movement of the way, who've told him not to go, but he feels compelled by the Spirit to go to Jerusalem and to do what God has put on his heart as he spreads the gospel. So we could probably call chapter 22 a chapter defense and accusations. So we pick up with Paul preparing to speak. And Paul addresses the crowd as brothers and fathers in Hebrew. That catches the attention. The mob becomes very quiet. And then Paul began his defense by providing all of his background about who he is. He was a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia. He was brought up in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel, a prominent Pharisee. And he was taught by Gamaliel the strictness of God's law. And so he was considered a zealous person toward God, just like them. And then Paul added that he had persecuted, he was honest about his history. He had persecuted all those who were in the way. He'd persecuted some to death. He bound and he delivered men and women to prison. He acted under the high priest and elders' authority. And Paul called upon their witness for himself. He had received letters from them to travel to Damascus, to bring those of the way back to Jerusalem for punishment. So he's telling all about his own story. And then we get to the pivotal moment, which we've heard before, because the first account we heard of Paul's conversion was back in Acts 9. But now Paul personally described the Lord's appearance to him on the road to Damascus. And about noon, a bright light shined around him. He said that the Lord had asked him why he was persecuting him. And what we come down to is that he was led by the hand into Damascus by his companions because he couldn't see. And he followed what was asked of him. Paul then described his obedience to the gospel when taught by Ananias. And Ananias came to Paul. He restored his sight. And so we hear his story again. This is not the last time that we will hear it. And so we get to the point that next Paul described how the Lord had sent him to the Gentiles. Paul returned to Jerusalem, and he was praying in the temple and was in a trance. And the Lord appeared to him and told him to quickly depart from Jerusalem, for the Jews would not receive his testimony concerning me. Paul attempted to explain to the Lord that he could make the Jews understand. And he responded that the Jews knew of his persecution of all those in the way. And he added that he even had consented to the death of Stephen, holding the killer's clothes. The Lord had told Paul of his plans for him. And so Paul was to depart. He was sent far away to the Gentiles. So when Paul mentions Gentiles, the crowd again becomes enraged, and they forcibly end his speech. And so when the Jews heard that he was sent to the Gentiles, they raised their voices. He should not be allowed to live. And they tore their clothes and threw dust all in the air. So at this point, the Romans prepared to examine Paul under a flogging. The tribune ordered that Paul be brought into the barracks. He wanted to know why they shouted so against him. He ordered that Paul should be examined under flogging, and the soldiers bound Paul with thongs. Now, Paul asked the centurion standing nearby, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" And the centurion, of course, had to say something because he asked Paul if he was a Roman citizen, and Paul affirmed that he was. And Roman law forbade that flogging would happen to a Roman citizen. So here we have the commanders that indicate that he has purchased his citizenship at a great price. But Paul says, no, not me. I was born a Roman. So now the soldiers are frightened because they know that this Roman is here, and they were prepared to flog him and to torture him. So they were afraid because they really had bound this Roman citizen. So the commander still wanted to know why he was accused by the Jews. And the next day, Paul was released from his chains. The chief priests and the council were commanded to appear, and Paul was brought before them. And that is exactly where we come up with the next chapter, chapter 24.
All right, Rose, you're a tough act to follow. You'll notice that Rose and I, as the last group, get all the trials and tribulations and anything but the luxury cruise. So I'm going to pick up essentially at chapter 23. And you'll see a lot of the same threads. Paul was very smart and very crafty how he went into these trials. He starts by, addressing people as brothers to essentially claim insider status with the Jewish leaders. He declares his clear conscience before God. And that may seem a little strange, given that he was persecuted. He persecuted followers of Jesus, as Rose just said, but it actually aligns itself well with the way that Luke portrays Paul. He's been zealous for God from the first to the last. To be sure, his experience on the road to Damascus has been enhanced and transformed by his understanding of what it might mean to align himself with God's purpose. But this only underscores the nature of this consistent commitment to serve rather than to work against God's agenda. So Paul's subsequent claim to be a Pharisee on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead, which is his core piece, which you see in verse 6 in the 23rd chapter, functions on two different levels. First, it comes as a pragmatic move designed to throw the Jewish council into turmoil, which apparently turned out to be very effective. If you have your Bibles with you, you can go to verse 7. That when he said this, a dissension began between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there's no resurrection or angel or spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge all three. So essentially, he drops a little bomb in the middle of the whole proceedings to get them arguing against one another and taking the attention off of himself. It's really pretty smart when you think about it. And essentially, they start fighting with one another, and when that becomes violent, the tribune, once again, fearing for Paul's safety, sends him back into the barracks while the others are sort of fighting all this out. And then verse 11, that night, the Lord stood near him and said, keep up your courage, for just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness in Rome. And that's what Paul hangs on to through all of these trials and tribulations and these crazy shipwrecks that happen. So eventually he gets back to Caesarea. And I'm going to ask Janae if she will, to pull up an image of Caesarea, which is still a very active place today. Now, Caesarea was quite the place in Paul's time. It was an important port city on the Mediterranean coast, having been established in the Hellenistic period, which was the 3rd century BC. And in 22 BC, Herod undertook one of his most ambitious enterprises, the construction of a new city and harbor, and he named it Caesarea Maritima in honor of its benefactor, Caesar Augustus. The harbor, and especially its arc-shaped wave breaker, you can sort of see the arcs in this photo, was an enormous project. It was built according to Roman design with piers, storage buildings, hostels for seamen, and temples to Augustus. The entrance to the harbor was adorned with huge statues. The city was well planned with markets and public baths and a theater, which you can see has been excavated and restored and is used today for concerts and theatrical performances. You can see that down in the lower right there. And the city also had a stadium and a hippodrome. Another enormous project for the city was an aqueduct for the transportation of water to the city from springs on the Carmel mountain range. In Paul's time, there were clashes between the Greek Syrian population and the Jewish community. And after Paul's arrest in Jerusalem, he was sent to Caesarea as a Roman citizen, where he was detained for 20 years before going to Rome. So that's where we pick up a bit as we move on in the story. And Janae, thanks for having that up. Luke tells the first stage of Paul's journey to Rome in remarkable detail. We've read about the Jewish, and Rose has also alluded to those, the Jewish plots against Paul, but only here do we have the insider knowledge of both the plan and the widespread support. It's significant that the two groups before whom Paul's just spoken, the Jews in Jerusalem and the Jewish council, are both involved in the plot. And so if you go to verse 12, you'll see a little bit about that. After the Lord has appeared to Paul in that vision, saying, take courage, we read that in the morning the Jews joined in a conspiracy and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink until they'd killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who joined in this conspiracy. And then it gets really interesting. Luke drops out of nowhere this family that we've not heard nothing about of Paul. All of a sudden, he has a sister, and the son of the sister, a nephew, kind of appears on the scene. He overhears this and goes to the tribune, tells him what's going to happen, And without checking any of the facts, the tribune sort of takes this at the nephew's face value and writes this letter transferring the authority of Paul over to Felix. And he writes it in this incredibly flattering sort of DC style, BS sort of kind of way to put himself in a very favorable light. I mean, the letter is overflowing with, how wonderful Felix is, etc. And so then we get Claudius's letter that bears witness to Paul's innocence. From here to the end of Acts, Paul's innocence is going to be a constant refrain. And it's very reminiscent of the threefold statement of Jesus' innocence by Rome's representative in Luke, remembering that Luke wrote both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. And Janae, if you'll pull up that trial chart, it'll give you some of the parallels that I think are really interesting. These trials have the same sort of a format. We'll just leave that up for a little bit. It kind of slips over a little bit into Rose's section, that particular trial. But the introduction that you see at the top in Jesus' case is Pilate. In Paul's case, it's going to be Festus. And the Herodian ruler in Jesus' day was Herod. And we'll hear a bit from Rose that the Herodian ruler for Paul was King Agrippa. So just sort of keep that in mind, that these trials follow a particular format. So moving on, chapters 24 to 26 report Paul's making his defense before Rome's representatives. First governors Felix and then Festus, and then King Agrippa. And this allows Luke to sharpen the point of controversy between Paul and his detractors and how to show from a Roman perspective that Paul is innocent of all the charges. And accordingly, it raises a question of why he continues to be in prison. And most importantly, these series of trials allow Paul the opportunity to maintain his allegiance to the Lord and to testify before Roman rulers. Speeches in legal context typically unfolded in three parts: an introduction designed to gain a favorable hearing, usually by flattering the audience or presenting oneself in a positive light. We've already said that Paul starts by calling people brothers, basically saying, I'm one of you. Second, a statement of the facts designed to establish the question on which judgment is needed. And that will come into a dispute between what Paul thinks he should be judged on and what the lawyer from the other side thinks he should be judged on. And third, reference to witnesses and testimony that prove the charge against the defendant is either true or false. And as we'll see, Paul and his opponents disagree about the question on which the judgment's needed. So moving on to chapter 24, and I'm kind of watching our time, Rose. I need to kind of speed up here. The lawyer for the high priest and the Jewish elders tries to flatter the governor, even though most people felt that the governor was kind of a scoundrel. Nevertheless, it doesn't keep them from trying to flatter. And so I'm picking up on the second verse. Your Excellency, because of you, we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight. We welcome this in every way and everywhere with utmost gratitude. He just lays it on thick. Once it gets to Paul, he does not have the services of a professional lawyer, but goes through the bits starting at verse 11 in chapter 24. I went to worship in Jerusalem, not to cause trouble. Where's the proof? Number 3, in fact, I'm a faithful Jew, holding to the resurrection hope. Number 4, I went to Jerusalem to bring alms and offer sacrifices in Jerusalem, and there was no disturbance when I did so. Number 5, where are my accusers? Number 6, the charge against me should be this, that I proclaim the resurrection. Paul thereby has countered the hired lawyer, first disagreeing about the reason he's on trial, and secondly, by admitting to a charge, the charge being his belief in proclamation of the resurrection hope. And that's outside of Roman legal concern. In effect, he's shifted the focus of the controversy away from himself and onto the nature of Israel's faith, that is, onto the good news of God. Let me wrap up really quickly so Rose gets in more about the trial. Felix was, as I said, kind of a scoundrel, and he's trying to get money and profit from Paul's situation. So he lets the case just sort of idle for 2 years, and rather than dispense with the case, he holds it over for the decision of the new governor. And the last inaction suggests that Felix had no reason not to release Paul, apart from his own desire to curry favor from the Jews. Let's just say that the Roman justice system was considered a little shady. Over to you, Rose. And you're muted.
There we go. So Felix is replaced by Festus. So here we are with no one in authority able to really decide what to do with Paul or his message. So shortly after Festus arrived in Caesarea, he went to Jerusalem. And the high priest and the chief men informed Festus about Paul. And they petitioned him, asking Festus a favor to bring back Paul to Jerusalem. So here we go, plots, all kinds of twists. The Jews planned to ambush and to kill Paul along the road as he traveled. I tell you, Paul cannot catch a break. And so Festus indicated that he would shortly be traveling back to Caesarea and invited those Jews in authority to travel there as well. And they could accuse Paul there. So after remaining in Jerusalem for about 10 days, then Festus returned to Caesarea. He called Paul before the judgment seat the next day, and the Jews attended to lay out serious complaints about Paul. However, they could not prove them. And I'm looking at now chapter 25, verse 8. Paul said in his defense, I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against the emperor. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, asked Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there? So he suggested that Paul should go someplace else. This was recommended to Paul because Festus, again, wanted to do a favor for the Jews at the time. So Paul responded, I'm appealing to the emperor where I should be tried. So he told Festus he had done no wrong in the Jews, and so you should know this. Paul was willing to die if he had committed anything worthy of death. But he had no guilt of these things for which the Jews had accused him. So Paul was not going to be delivered to the Jews. He was a Roman citizen, which he keeps playing. Paul then attended to the emperor. He appealed there, and Festus replied, you have appealed to the emperor? To the emperor, you will go. So here we are. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice his daughter, came to Caesarea to greet Festus as the new governor, replacing Felix. And then Festus laid out Paul's case before Agrippa. And he noted that Felix had left Paul a prisoner with his case unresolved for all this time, just letting him sit there. And we know that this was at least 2 years. So Festus recalled that the priests and elders of the Jews informed him about Paul during his recent visit to Jerusalem. And Festus recounted all of this to Agrippa, and he told him that the Jews, that it was not custom for a Roman to be delivered to death without the accused having the opportunity to answer the charges face to face. So upon Festus' return to Caesarea, he had Paul come before the tribunal, and he discovered nothing wrong in Paul, other than that there were some questions about their own religion, about the Jews. Again, that insider thing that Jan was just talking about. And so Festus asked Paul to then go to Jerusalem, since he was at a loss on how to really deal with this situation. And at that point, Festus noted that Paul appealed to the emperor. And so Festus explained Paul's case. Agrippa requested to then hear Paul himself. So Festus said to Agrippa, "Tomorrow you shall hear him. Tomorrow you shall hear him." And Paul was brought before Agrippa the next day, following a much big procession of distinguished grandeur and splendor upon the entry of Agrippa and Bernice into the hall where the military tribune and the other prominent men of the city were gathered. And so he reported that the Jewish community claimed that Paul was not fit to live any longer. However, Festus stated that he found Paul again had done nothing to deserve death. We know that Paul had appealed to the emperor and that he was going to send him. Festus indicated that he had nothing to write against Paul, and he hoped that after Agrippa's examination of Paul, he may have something to write. He thought it was unreasonable to send an appeal without specifying the charges, legalese. So in this section, Paul has appeared before the Jewish authorities, a governor, and now a king as prophesied. And as Jesus was brought before Herod, again, as Jan noted, Antipas, so Paul comes before Herod Agrippa. Over and over, Paul's innocence, though, is declared. So Paul went before Agrippa and made his defense. In this fifth and last speech, Paul reviewed his life as a Jew before his conversion. Again, we have heard this, and King Agrippa gave Paul permission to speak for himself. So Paul began by acknowledging that Agrippa was an expert in the Jewish customs and questions concerning Jews. I have to tell you, folks, I think that I'm a bit cynical here about Paul, that he's really playing up to Agrippa. So as we look at chapter 26, verses 2 and 3, he says, "I consider myself fortunate that I am before you, King Agrippa. I am to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, because you are especially familiar with all of the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." Like a reprise, Paul again told of his former life as a Jew and Pharisee, that he had spent his early life in Jerusalem, and he was known to all the committed Jews. We again hear that he was a member of the strictest sect, the Pharisees, and how he now stands on trial account of his hope again in the promise made by God to the ancestors. Paul reiterated that it was the core accusation, this hope. So here he's proposing literally that Christianity that we know is the legitimate development from Judaism. And Paul asked Agrippa, "Why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead?" Now, did you catch what just happened? The speech shifts a bit from a defense, and now Paul has gone to evangelism. He then stated that he originally thought that he should act contrary to Jesus. He's telling about his history again. He cast out his followers, put them into prison, voted for their deaths, punished them, compelled them to blaspheme. He even persecuted them from foreign cities. So Paul again recounts all of this story, and he told of the Lord's appearance again on the road to Damascus. Paul was really sent by the Lord to the Gentiles to open their eyes, that they may receive forgiveness of sins. And Paul told Agrippa that he had to be obedient to the heavenly vision. He declared the gospel in Damascus, Judea, Jerusalem, and then to the Gentiles. Paul told the Gentiles to repent, to return to God, and to the works of repentance. He said, for these things, the Jews seized him at the temple and tried to kill him. Paul only preached these things which the prophets and Moses had said would come to pass. That the Christ would suffer, that the Christ would be the first to rise from the dead, and that he would proclaim the light to the Jews and to the Gentiles. Festus then he had it. So he interrupts Paul, coming pretty close to Paul being a nut. He just basically says that. And he interjected at Paul's defense with this loud voice. And this is 26:24 to 25. While he was making his defense, Festus exclaimed, "You are out of your mind. Too much learning is driving you insane." Thank you. But much learning is driving you mad. So Paul replied, "I am not mad. I am not insane. Most notable Festus, but speak the words of truth and wisdom." And he pointed out that Agrippa knew all these things. And Paul further noted that none of these things had been done in a corner. Paul asked Agrippa if he believed in the prophets. He had a brief dialogue with Agrippa about his belief. He addressed Agrippa, "Do you believe in the prophets? I know you believe." And Agrippa replied, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." See, he's got his evangelism mojo going. And so Paul responded that he would, for not only Agrippa, but for all who heard him, to become Christians at that time. And so we move forward and we find that this is the time that Paul is, in a sense, released, and he's heading off now to Rome. Paul exemplified how closely the ministry and witness of the servant would be to resemble the life and trials of Jesus. You got the journey, Jan.
All right. Janae, will you pull up the handy dandy map again? So this journey is the orange dotted line. So we start sort of in Caesarea. And as you read this chapter, this was anything but a luxury cruise. I told Rose, I've actually been to a lot of these places. I did it on a cruise ship. He covered a lot of territory, but he did it the hard way, I guarantee you. So going from Caesarea, he gets to Sidon. And then they're under the lee of Cyprus because they're encountering a lot of wind and storms. They get their way to Myra in Lycia, then they pick up a new ship that's headed towards Rome. They hit all kinds of troubles. They go around and stop in Fair Havens it's on Crete. And that's when the really exciting stuff happens. As they near Malta, the ship gets wrecked and they go through all kinds of troubles. You read it, and in the interest of time, I won't do all the gory details, but the ship runs aground, crashes, and they have to swim to Malta to safety. And Malta proves to be a very good stop for them. They're warmly received. Paul makes quite the splash with having a snake attached to his hand, and he shakes the snake off. And so they're convinced that Paul's somebody very special, and so they get good treatment. They're there for 3 months, receiving warm hospitality until they then make their way on to Rome. And one of the interesting things about their time on Malta is the motifs of healing and hospitality intertwine as we see. I'm going to quickly flip ahead to chapter 28 in verses 8 to 10. Paul heals the father of one of their hosts. He visits him, cures him by praying and putting his hands on him. And after this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They bestowed many honors on us, and when we were about to sail, they put on board all the provisions we needed. So off they go to Rome. And even though Paul is greeted by followers of Jesus, it's really more about what happens while he's on house arrest. And Janae, would you mind switching over to the image of something that all of you can see today if you go to Rome? And Janae's going to pull up that slide in just a minute. There is an Anglican center in Rome, and it's located on the Via del Corso, which is one of the main streets, as you know, in Rome. And literally almost underneath the church that's right there, Santa Maria in Violata, is a place that in the crypt, many believe was where Paul was actually under house arrest for the time that he was in Rome, that you read about in that final chapter of the book of Acts. While Paul was under house arrest, he would continue to see people, proclaim the good news, and use that time to once again share and evangelize to anyone who came his way. And being under house arrest was a pretty loose thing in those days. People could come and go. There was a soldier there with Paul, but he really had pretty free reign while he was under house arrest. And as we read towards the end of the 28th chapter, he had mixed success. In the 24th verse of chapter 28, some were convinced while others refused to believe. But it doesn't deter Paul. I mean, it doesn't look like much would. And we find as we move, I want to give us just a couple minutes for questions. As we close out, that Paul had an impact. He had strong notes of finality, only then to be found again, proclaiming the good news in synagogues. Some Jews heard and really received the message. And the closing of Acts has Paul living in Rome, welcoming all who would come. At the end, Paul's continued proclamation demonstrates that this proclamation is not silenced by opposition from any quarter and bears witness to the universal reach of the message he proclaims. And just as sort of a amen on this, and of course, that proclamation and story of the good news continues today through you and through me. Rose, any concluding words as we kind of...
Just one thing, and before we get to some of the questions, really this final episode really completes the plan from Acts 1:8, that Jesus's followers would be witnesses to the end of the earth. And this ending may seem a little abrupt, but the ending is fitting conclusion with a note of triumph for Paul as he continues to really witness to the reign of God, encouraging us to do the same now in our time. So I had to go, Janae, I know you're on top of these questions too, but one that kind of stood out for me, there are 3 or 4 of them here. From Jane, there's a longer one up above that, but how are we to understand the implied negative connotation attached to the Jews in these verses? I think what we find is we are dealing with the Jewish authorities and their rigidness toward what would be the coming of the Messiah. And for all those followers that came after, like Paul, like James, like all of those other apostles in that way. And so we have that same problem as we encounter, particularly during Holy Week on Good Friday, when we go to John's Gospel and it talks about the Jews and all of their involvement with the process leading to eventually Jesus' crucifixion. But we're dealing with those authorities. And you also see their inability to kind of see beyond just the law. I know, Jan, if you wanted to add to that in any way too.
Nope, I was skimming through the other questions to see if we could pick up. One of the questions was a little bit about our resources. Rose and I actually have the same study Bible, the New Interpreter's Study Bible. We strongly encourage study Bibles. Some of the commentaries that we used, one is interpretation. You probably have it handy, Rose.
I do.
And I drew heavily from the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. There's so many excellent resources out there, and we could go on and on and on about that. But I think first and foremost is just an openness to dig deeper and learn more. And a study Bible is a great place to start. And I know that our colleagues have been talking about some of their study Bibles. We have many that we use, but Rose and I discovered that we tend to use New Interpreters. And let's see, Rose, if we have...
I would say for Doug Miller, can you mention a little bit more about Bernice? All I can tell you is that she was a Jewish queen of the Roman Empire during the second half of the 1st century. So Bernice was a member of that Herodian dynasty that ruled Rome, the Roman province of Judea, between 39 BC and I want to say close to 100, but probably around the 90s. And she was obviously the daughter of King Agrippa, and she was the sister of King Agrippa II. That's about all I know that I can share at this moment.
Pretty incestuous after a while.
Yes.
Janae, did you pick up any other questions?
Oh, yeah. about the change in Nancy. I think Randy hit on this a little bit last week. We go from this change of kind of like, oh, we're telling the story, then it becomes this kind of first person experience, and we did this and I did this. So I can't say I know why that switch happened, or why Luke did that. Maybe it was to make it a much more personal thing as we go through all the trials and the tribulations, all the accusations, and Paul is saying, this is who I am, this is who I am. So that's the best I could probably do on that one.
Thank you both. And I have one in the chat from Beth, who discusses the difference between Jesus's lack of political status versus how Paul leverages his political status and the difference between those two. So do you, either one of you, have any thoughts on that?
I was trying to look for it too. Is it in the chat?
It's in the chat.
The chat.
Mm-hmm. She said, it is very interesting to see the comparison of Jesus's trial, Luke's version, and Paul's trial in Acts.
Yes, it's almost as though we have Paul, like relive kind of the pattern of how things happen, showing that as we go to it, we think about what Jesus said, basically, whatever happens to the leader will happen to the follower. And so we see this continuation of that those parallels, but it also marks something really important for us about what it means to be a true disciple and putting your life to the faith. Jan, did you have?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would contrast between Jesus and Paul leaned heavily and leveraged the fact that he was a Roman citizen.
Yeah.
Jesus was a Jew through and through. And so he ran afoul of Jewish authorities. The beef wasn't with the Roman
At all.
occupiers, it was with the Jewish authorities. And Paul purposefully sidesteps that. He claims his Jewishness when it works to his advantage.
And there's like, ooh, I'm a Roman.
But pretty quickly flips over to claiming his Roman citizenship because it gives him certain advantages that he wouldn't have without that. Is that helpful? I hope.
I think that was extremely helpful. And so thank you too for ending the Bible study on such a sweet, sweet and educational note.
And we would like to say a prayer on the way out of this. So the Lord be with you.
Thank you to Janae too.
Thank you, Janae.
My pleasure.
So let us pray. Eternal God, we thank you for guiding us through this time together in Bible study. Your word has enlightened our minds, it's comforted our hearts, strengthened our spirits. May the lessons we've learned resonate in our lives, guiding us into your truth. Keep us steadfast in your love and let your wisdom flourish in our daily actions. All this we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you all so much for
Thank you.
hanging in there with us, and we hope you have a wonderful, restful summer, and we'll continue to tune in to our programs and worship services and morning prayer services, and you bless us. So thank you for this opportunity to spend a little time with you this evening.
Thank you and blessings.
God bless. Bye-bye.